Us.
Us.
Hello, all. Greetings. Hey, Mitch.
Us. Hey, how are you?
Good to see you. Uh, Welcome again. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to continue on with our look at injury prevention and management. We went through some really good stuff last week, got a lot of feedback privately on PM, on private messages and so on. But today, we're just going to add a few more little things that I think are really valuable. Uh, the primary objective of why we're doing this is because the notion that injuries are an unavoidable and necessary evil is bogus. Generally speaking, of course, there are impact injuries which you can never help. There's just nothing you can do. You get knocked out, fall down, hit your shoulder, and dislocate. That happens. But in terms of most injuries, I'd say 90% of injuries, you know what they say, 87% of all statistics are just made up on the spot. But anyway, probably 90% of injuries are avoidable.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, different sports and activities, you can quantify them in different ways. So, for example, if you're in the gym lifting weights or you're swimming or something or running around a track, there should be no injuries. There's no excuse for injuries in those situations. When you swim, the hardest thing you hit is water and you're going straight up and down a lane. There's no intervention. So training injuries that are a result of that are actually training errors. They're a misread of the body. If you're lifting weights in the gym, no one's stopping you, it's an imbalance in your training program. It's poor technique. It's poor whatever happens to be. Now, if you get into karate, where the purpose of karate is to punch you to the point that you can't continue or knock you out, from a probability scale, the likelihood of injury has increased. If you're in grappling arts and the point is to sublux a joint or choke you out, the probability or likelihood has increased, but not to the point where it's just this will just happen. That's not how it should be.
Indeed. And I'd say that one constant amongst it all is we listen to the voice of the ego. We can't help ourselves. We're in the gym, we're doing our own thing. We should have blinkers on, but there's someone over there we want to impress, so we put an extra couple of plates on the end and we hurt ourselves.
Yeah.
Yep. In the dojo, when you're grappling, it's the same thing. We tell ourselves that we're rolling with someone who's not the same rank as us, so we're not going to tap. We're not going to tap. Not going to tap. Oh, I better tap now. So, well, usually if you tap 5 seconds earlier than what you do, your life expectancy in the game would increase a lot.
And I think you said that Hodger Gracie interview with Lex Friedman. He talked about something like that. The reserves. I can't remember it exactly, but you talked. And correct me if I'm mistaken. But if you tap earlier or at the appropriate time, you have so much more reserve in terms of chokes and tapping that your body has for when it really needs to use it. Is that?
Yeah, that's a
right?
really that interview on Lex Friedman on Roger Gracie. That's really worth looking at. And what he points out is no one likes to tap. He says, first of all, no one likes to. I don't like to tap, but I tapped tens of thousands of times, and I always tapped earlier. And I'm guessing probably half the time he tapped, he probably could have fought his way out of, but he didn't. And he said, by tapping earlier, next time you're not tapped to force earlier. He says, if you tap late, next time the damage that's done means that you have to tap a little earlier. Then you have to tap a little earlier. Then you have to tap a little earlier. And every time you tap late, you damage your joints to the point where later on you not only do you have to tap early, you can't even roll anymore. And then you get those warriors that sit on the side of the mat going, no, I can't roll. I've got too many injuries. Some people wear them like medals.
Yes.
Mm.
This is true.
So we wanted to go over a few things today, which I think we could probably incorporate in our day-to-day training.
Yep.
You want to start off?
Sure. I think the first one, and we touched on this, you probably went over it quite a bit last session, but I think it's so important, it's worth reiterating. And Xian messaged me today just to reinforce it as well, is the warm-up. I know it sounds like we might be on repeat with this, but the warm-up is probably one of the most important things that we can do to minimize and prevent injury. And the longer we take to warm up, the longer our training career, the better state our body will be in for the training session ahead, and the better opportunity we have to get a feel and a read on how our body is in this moment to train.
The problem is when people have a lot of training experience, there's some quirk in their head that tells them that the warm-up is actually an imposition on their time. So, look, we'll warm up as we train rather than actually consciously choosing a warm-up. Honestly, at my age, the warm-up quite often is my workout. I'll be honest with you. If I wanted to train every day, for me, sometimes one of those days will be nothing more than a good warm-up session, because you have to respect the danger of the age and so on. So that's a really important thing that Mitch said, is we can never underestimate how important the warm-up is. And warm-up can be specifically adapted as well.
Also, it should have a general and a specific component. The general component is warming the body up, body temperature wise, some general movements and so on, some stretching. And then the specific part of the warm up is the drills at a lower intensity, where in Kyokushin it could be the footwork drills, it could be all the splitting, shadow boxing, and so on, to prepare the body for movements and that are going to be happening in the session ahead, depending on what the session is.
Yeah.
And the second part, I just want to give you a concept of the warm-up as well, and we are just talking about this before we hit record, is different sports. Like if you go to what's called the alactic sports, the things that require enormous amount of force and energy output, things like weightlifting, things like short track sprint, the field events, okay, in track and field.
So alactic, just for those people who aren't sure, would describe an athletic event with a very, very short time period.
Yeah, basically alactic means without oxygen. Even there's no oxygen requirement for that sport.
Some of them even hold their breath.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So in certain weightlifting movements, throwing a javelin, throwing a hammer, discus, shot put, high jump, these are all alactic events. 60-meter indoor sprint. And so what's interesting about that is, and something that you just said before, Shian, is the higher the level of the athlete in those types of sports, the longer their warm up has to be. They have to start gentle and they warm up so much longer, because their end force output is going to be, and the speed is going to be so high, potentially the highest in the world if they're the best in the world. You can't afford to shorten the warm up.
So the greater the intensity, the greater the importance of the
warm up, and the longer it will be. If you've ever watched a track athlete, say a 60, 100 or 200 meter sprinter warm up, it takes a long time. This is not something they cut. They take a long time. There's so much technical work and warming up required. But in karate or martial arts, for example, it's so skill-based. If someone's so skilled, they can get away with certain things because their end force output isn't as absolute. Yes, we have a lot of forces, but their distance, angle, timing, rhythm, and so on, that throwing a javelin or doing a 100-meter sprint doesn't have. So you can't hide from it in those alactic sports, whereas you can, unfortunately, here.
Yeah.
But I think that comes back to bite the martial artist on the butt a little bit long term, like you talked about before, like cutting the corners a little bit in the warm up.
Very, very important. And as you get older, the need to listen and respect your body's messages is really important. And I can tell you now, the first message we ignore is, I really need to warm up. There's even an almost perverse scientific, we mentioned last week, this concept, which for many people they believe has some sort of scientific base, that a warm up and stretching before is a waste of time, that the best time to stretch and so on is after the workout because you're warm.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Well, we covered that last week, and no, for me at least, and I know for you because we've trained a lot together, the answer is no. Now, I would never stop someone stretching post-training. Go for it. But is it the best ultimate time? Absolutely not.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and some very specific ideas of movement and exercise to help prevent injury.
You mentioned, do you want to mention the first one in relation to the knee?
Well, I think one thing that people, of course, there's no absolutes, so nothing works 100% of the time. But one of the most valuable things I ever learned to protect your knees was straight dorsiflexion of the ankle. So that means I'm going to put my foot, I'm going to flex it back like that. I don't want the foot angles like this. So when we do our warm up in Kyokushin, where we put our thigh on our leg here, and you see guys often they put it here and push the knee for a warm up. Okay, that's a shortcut to long-term knee damage. But if you put your foot here and dorsiflex it so that the angle, let me move back a bit, so that the angle of the ankle is 90 degrees, accurately straight dorsiflexed, that will protect the knee 500% more. And also if you roll, if you grapple, and you're doing things like triangles or trying to get your leg behind someone in rubber guards and so on, never pull your ankle like this, because that's going to put pressure on the outside of your knee. Always pull your heel and keep your foot dorsiflexed. That's a really, really valuable tip that you can use to at least give yourself a few more years of training.
And you identified that through all your experience in training over the years, right?
Yes, that was actually a yoga thing, where in yoga they protect the knee through dorsiflexion of the ankle, and it has transferred very well for me over the years in training.
And I know in the sessions we've done in jiu-jitsu, you've always, with the triangles, you always mention that to all the students, which we could probably extend that to something that I call squareness through the body and squareness in all joints.
What do you mean exactly by squareness?
Well, exactly what you just talked about. So that the joint is generally at 90 degrees, so that it's not flexed necessarily. It's not crazy extended. It's at 90 degrees. It's in a normal squarish position. And yes, dorsiflex. You are dorsiflexing it up as high as you can, but that's doing is putting the joint in a 90-degree position in a healthy alignment. You've got a fantastic acronym for stretching, the GRAB.
Yep, I use the acronym grab a stretch. Okay, and by that I mean G is gravity. One of the worst things you could do is fight the stretch, and we'll do that. We think we're stretching, but we're actually fighting it. We feel as though by tensing in some way it's going to help, but in actual fact the G stands for gravity, where you just need to relax and let gravity do the work for you. The R stands for relaxation. Okay, it's very hard to relax to stretch a muscle that's not relaxed. There's quite often a point where if you stretch it too far, there's like a tendon reflex.
Yeah, like a reciprocal inhibition. It'll just tense up as a protective mechanism.
Reciprocal inhibition. That's exactly what I was thinking. I've never heard of that term, but that's exactly what it is. But once again, if you just relax, that also relaxes. The A in GRAB stands for alignment, and this is what Mitch is talking about. When you talk about squaring your body up, it means when you're stretching, sometimes it's not a good thing to misalign your body and stretch in a way that can actually cause damage in one way or another. You're much better off aligning your body so that it's square. So every stretch, without exception, every stretch has an optimal alignment.
Absolutely.
And I think as instructors, it's really important. One, we understand it. One of the things that you find as you travel around a lot is half the problems the world have is the instructors don't know what they're doing. But instructors need to be able to teach the students what is the correct angle of alignment for this particular stretch, not just for the joint that you're stretching or the muscles that you're stretching, but for the entire body. Okay. And in yoga, they have a thing called drishti. Drishti is the point of focus. And every yoga posture has a point of focus. So, for example, if I'm stretching up like this, the point of focus is my thumbs. If I'm stretching forward, the point of focus is my toe, for example. So you have to understand that the A in GRAB stands for alignment. It's really, really important. And the B, of course, stands for breathing, breath. You have to coordinate your stretch with your breath. You have to relax. So the G, gravity, R, relaxation, A, alignment, and B, breath. And if you combine those four when you stretch, you'll never go wrong.
It's such great advice. And try it yourself if you haven't already. I highly recommend doing that.
Beautiful. Now, what other points do you think you'd like to mention here? Because I know you did mention some.
Yeah. So with the squareness of the joints and alignment of the body, without turning this into War and Peace, a simple thing is, for example, in Kyokushin, standing there in Yoi, for example, or when it comes to doing body weight squats, because physical conditioning is such a huge part of Kyokushin karate, you'll often see people's feet, and they're rarely straight. They're usually splayed out in certain ways.
So by that, you'll see guys, and they're standing like this, and they're standing like this,
Yes.
and they do squats like this.
Yep.
Okay. What Mitch wants you to do is, you explain, Mitch.
Or be square. So feet straight, 50-50 weight left and right. Weight a little more on the toes maybe compared to heels, but say 50-50 just for argument's sake. This is the alignment and squareness we're talking about here. And so the feet, as Sean squats down, the feet stay straight in that position. They don't turn out. Now, if your feet turn out, it's not because your feet turn out squatting, it's because you don't have the flexibility or physical conditioning to squat with your feet straight. And that's an opportunity for you to improve. So we see all these weird and wacky kind of ways of doing things. Yeah. We generally, yes.
Guys do that.
Yeah. We don't want that.
Squatting.
Yeah. Now, if you're talking to a weightlifter or a power lifter, their feet will be a little bit externally rotated because it moves their center of mass closer to the bar. I completely understand that. But we're just talking here about body weight training and general training in the dojo. And this is a fantastic starting point. If you're a little externally rotated, it's not the end of the world. But we don't want to see going out excessively. It just doesn't help your body. And then when you're squatting, it's actually helping the flexibility that you have. It's actually jamming the femur up into the acetabulum, into the hip joint a little bit more, which is what we don't want. The muscles aren't firing as well as they're ideally done. And yeah, I could go on about it, but just feet straight.
So in that respect, pretty well every session, rarely, I can't think of a session of stretching where I would deliberately not do this, but pretty well every single more stretching session I do starts with my feet aligned straight, and I squat down to get full flexion in my knees in an attempt. See how my feet have turned out slightly? That's a natural thing that I don't have the full flexibility. You may find when you do it, your feet turn out more. You may find that you're able to keep your feet more parallel. If you want to keep them parallel, you just take them a little wider, and then you probably won't have the same level of compulsion for your feet to turn out. Okay, but if you get deep with your feet there, then bring them in slightly, and then start to go down until you can do it there. But this is a great warm-up for me, I find, because one, it gives me full flexion in my knees, and two, it's a great warm-up for my back. It helps to stretch my back. You can just sit here if you like. Just round your back and stretch, and then when you come up, it's just a great starting point for a good stretching routine, I think.
And that's really reflective of you. I mean, you train a lot and you still have the ability to do that. And a lot of athletes and people don't have the ability to do that. So it's a real credit to you that you have the connective tissue health to be able to do it. And a lot of people would benefit enormously in their bodies, spending some time each day, a few minutes to develop that, to get your body in that position. Don't expect, Rome wasn't built in a day, as we all know. We're all martial artists, techniques take time. And just start where you are and progress over time.
My joints disagree with you. They sound like bags of sand when I bend down. But we were talking about this. One of the most important things you can do when you're rehabbing and working stretching is full range of motion. As far as possible, you must stretch the full joint flexion and the full joint extension of pretty well everything you can, particularly the knees, because when you have surgery on the knee, quite often you unconsciously let it heal where it's not fully able to extend to its full degree. And that's suicide, I think.
Yeah, in ACL rehab, anterior cruciate ligament rehab, it's common the surgeon will want you to get full extension and full flexion ideally. And if you don't get it, the likelihood, in my experience, of re-injury increases. So one of the things you want to work on, now you're not going to get that day one necessarily, but it's important over the weeks, months, and years, if necessary, that you do work to get equal flexion extension to the other leg just as a baseline. So yeah, I can't stress the importance of that enough. So if you have been injured, of course, work within range, like pain-free range. But then after that, you do have to spend some time getting full range back, because that's how the body was intended to work.
Exactly.
It's really important. Now, we were talking about the lower body there, but what about the beautiful Kyokushin Kihon for the upper body?
I just think people don't recognize, particularly, don't recognize the beauty and the value of the Kihon done correctly. Because what happens is, as people get older, their technique gets worse. So instead of having the nice scapular retraction that pulls the shoulders back and around, elbows are narrow, fists are a little wider, this actually takes a degree of flexibility through the back, spine, scapula, shoulders. Okay. And then what happens is, as you get older, and unfortunately, some people think 35 is old. Oh man, I'm old now. I'm 35 now. Give me a break. And what happens is, they don't connect the importance of flexibility to the basics. So when they're young, they can do this without any sense of contraction or tightness through the body. And then what happens is, as they get older, to maintain that freedom from sense of tightness, it goes from this to this to this to this to this. So if you reverse that trend and remember that as you get older, the scapular retraction, pulling the arm back here, everything you do, you get that, you treat the basics as a form of stretching, and you'll maintain beautiful postural integrity, upper body integrity through the spine. I can't tell you how important it is to get that beautiful spinal straightness, contraction. I call it perineal lock. Mitch calls it thin tummy, tight cheeks, where you actually make that conscious adjustment of your spine, so that when you're doing things, you're not rounding your back. You have this integrated sense of postural strength. And that's really, really beautifully developed through the basics.
I couldn't agree more. And that position, Xian, that you do in this position here, it's exact opposite to how you were standing before, when you were standing in this kind of position that happens with imbalanced training.
Yes. It's this, where your feet are out like this and the shoulders round, so you have the chest
collapsed,
protracting in to bring the shoulders around like that. This is a symptom of imbalanced training. Whereas if you work on the idea of parallel feet, perineal elevation, diaphragmatic tightness, scapular retraction. So look, the hands go from this to this, and you get that. What happens is, you maintain a very youthful posture even as you get older.
And you said something before about Solso would say in training, hide the elbow. Is that right?
Yes. Solso always used to say, from the front, you should never see the elbow. So if I'm doing uchiuke, this elbow is not possible. This one here, not visible. It's not this. See, guys have that's exaggerating it, but my God, you see it all the time. What you want to do is scapular retraction, pull the elbow in, pull the elbow in, pull the elbow in, pull the elbow in. See that? Not, this is sadly very common. This sort of thing, where if the elbow is visible from the front, you're not getting the full correct range of motion in the technique. That's really, really vital.
And what's interesting about that from just a coaching point of view, when I see that, I think, oh, there's an athlete that's rehearsing more of what they don't want. So you're re-ingraining that into the body, an exact patterning or movement that you don't want. And connective tissues aren't having to lengthen from the front if we're just here. That changes everything. That's effort and energy expenditure required that will shift you posturally and technically, obviously, as well.
And once again, this is a perfect example of where, as you get older, and when I say older, you don't even have to be as old as me. Anything above competitive age, you could argue the nature of your training changes. There's no compulsion to have extremely high level technique anymore because you're not competing. That's exactly when you need to start to focus on the importance and value of a very good warm-up and treating the basics. If you do the 30 basics, you stretch every single muscle in the body. If it's done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, you hardly stretch a thing because everything you do is within the current range of motion. You have to keep expanding that range of motion so you can actually take the 30 basics and a good stretching warm-up, and that can be your workout for a 35, 40-year-old, 45, 50, 60, 65-year-old. But never be satisfied with the techniques moving in the range of current motion.
Yeah, of what you've currently got. We've got to force adaptations in our body. Our body wants to be in a complete state of homeostasis. It doesn't want to move. It doesn't want to adapt and change. Hence, you get breathless when you do something difficult. Your joint, your muscles don't like it when you go to a range that they're not used to. You get soreness the next day and swelling and inflammation as your body trying to say, don't do that again. But secretly, well, not secretly, the body adapts to that once you rest it a little bit and then go again. And then all of a sudden it adapts and gets better and better. So we want to always expect more from our training is what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, exactly. And Sensei Mike Clark just went mentioned. He made a point, he intimates towards there is more and more karate, but there doesn't seem to be more and more dissemination of good quality principles, training principles. The focus is different. You've only got to look at the karate Olympics.
Your bucket?
Sorry, just felt emotionally traumatized for a second. But anyway, you've only got to look at the karate in the Olympics. It's become a sport within a very small range of techniques and requirements. So it's not Budo, it's not martial arts. It's just a sport that somewhat resembles fighting. It's not, of course. But anyway, that's where the onus of responsibility lies very strongly with the instructor to make sure that, one, they understand exactly what they're teaching. Don't try and teach something simply because you have your black belt, because it's like Chinese whispers. If your instructor taught you slightly differently, or if your instructor didn't do it correctly, you 100% copy your instructor and you're still wrong. So the onus of responsibility is on yourself to research and understand and do whatever you need to fully be able to pass on correctly to your students.
Absolutely. That's such great points. Now, what about if you are injured? Do you have more to cover on that, or do you want to?
No, I think that's a good place to stop. You get the idea. There are alignment concepts, alignment principles, timing principles that you need to take in mind in your day-to-day training. But like we said, sometimes an injury does happen. So injury management then becomes vital.
Really important.
Number one rule for injury management?
Don't redo it, but rest, ice, compression.
Yes.
So RICE, everyone would have heard the term RICE. I think it's RICED now, RICED. So rest, ice, compression, elevation, and then the D is for diagnosis or doctor. If you're not sure what's going on, you want to find out what's going on. I know Dr. Google, like Professor Google, is out there, and
Sensei
Google,
YouTube.
Sensei YouTube, yeah. But you do, if you're not sure, if you've lacked the experience, you want to get a diagnosis and find out what's going on, because the body does take time to heal if things go haywire. But the first is rest. So take the stimulus away. Very, very important. The second is ice. There's some controversy around icing. I want to be clear on that. I know there's different schools of thought, and you should do what you want to do. But my experience is that seconds and minutes matter. If someone requires icing, they've done something, they require ice immediately. If you do it in 10 minutes versus 10 seconds, the difference in outcome from my experience is significant.
I have a little story about that. I remember many years ago, we were at a training camp over at Stradbroke Island, and we were doing throws. And the guy I was partnered with did a really bad throw, and my leg was at an angle like that, and he put lateral pressure right on my knee, and I felt and heard my knee just collapse. We were right across the other side. I instantly went straight back to the campsite, and I got ice, and I put ice on it, and I wrapped it in a bandage. By the time everybody came back from the were you there at that camp?
I wasn't at that one.
The next morning run, they had me on a chair like a throne in a trailer, dragging the trailer around. But the point was, I got that ice on my knee within a few minutes, and I kept it on for the entirety of the camp. And I know, like Mitch says, there's different schools of thought. From my experience, I have a very particular way that I ice things.
Yep.
And I have a particular approach to muscular injury as opposed to joint injury, as opposed to bone injury. All very different. And as a result of that, my knee was relatively injury-free for the next 30 years. So it's really important that you understand that time is of the essence. I treat it like post-training nutrition. We mentioned you got these big doors and they close. And an hour and a half later, it's too late.
Yeah, an opportunity cost has happened. Yeah.
Mm.
So when it comes to the ice, that's such a great explanation of it. I'm generally speaking a fan of it. And then you've got the compression, and we know compression is valuable because usually when a child or anyone hurts themselves, what they'll do, they'll touch it straight away, and that's our body signaling that compression is good
and isolating it too. There,
hands can be healing, and that touch and that energy and the compression is a great thing. And the ice and the compression and the rest specifically, and the elevation to get it above the heart. So when they're talking about elevation, it's above the heart is where you want to go. So if it's a lower body injury, laying in bed and put your foot above your heart, above the hip level with pillows or towels or whatever it happens to be. But this is all to minimize the inflammatory response. Now, inflammation is not a bad thing. Inflammation is a protective mechanism that our body has to say, hey, silly, don't do that to me again. So that's what it's attempting to do. But we want to, it's good for the inflammation process to happen, but we don't want to exacerbate it by not doing these things. We want to just let it do what it's required to do. And then we can start to move on, because we want the cells or the tissues around the body not to be damaged as well. We want them to heal.
Very good points. The D at the end of the RICE, we're all used to RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. The D, the diagnosis, I can't emphasize how important that is, because the longer we train, the more we think we know. And it's very easy. And I admit that certain injuries that we have, our diagnosis based on our experience over many, many years is generally very accurate. But if there is an injury and you even have a small inkling that something's not right in a way that you understand, immediately go and get it diagnosed. I'll tell you a story. Everyone who's ever done kumite in the dojo has calf injuries. You can just tear a calf that quickly. And I remember one night I was in the dojo doing kumite, and I thought someone had kicked me from behind. You know, when there's a bunch of people, it's a mess, and then sometimes someone falls and they kick you in the back and you get a cork. That's what it felt like. But I turned around, there was no one there. So it was clear that I'd torn my calf muscle. So I put ice on it immediately. I compressed it immediately. The next day, I thought, this isn't the same response as I normally have. So I went to the hospital. I explained to them that I'd torn my calf. and it just felt a little funky. They took me into the diagnosis immediately, and I'm sitting there chatting to the guy. He's checking it out with an ultrasound, and I said, "How's it looking?" And he went, "Yeah, not too bad." And he went bang and hit the emergency button on the wall, and an ICU team came in and put me on the bed. Like they had things going in and out of me. They found the gastroc was torn, the soleus was torn, the fascia was torn, and they found 3 blood clots sitting in the vein.
Wow.
Of the torn vein as well, the torn blood vessel. And I spoke to my good friend Jackie Wood. Jackie Wood, if you're out there, g'day. One of Australia's great athletes who just happened to be one of the black belts in Frank Everett's dojo back in the 70s.
Wow.
And Jackie Wood is a high-level nurse, and she pointed out once that probably 90% of the blood clot problems that men have originate in torn calf muscles in former athletes.
Wow.
So if you tear your calf, really take notice. 3 blood clots that they said could have migrated to my heart at any time, and I wouldn't be here today talking to Mitch. He'd have to do it all by himself.
Yep, and no one would watch that.
Yeah, and but anyway, so please, the diagnosis, if you're even fractionally concerned, get it diagnosed. We have a brilliant medical system. Most countries do. Get there, deal with it.
It's and just to add one more point to that, I found over the years that people will research and get more opinions on a television or a car purchase than they will in terms of a diagnosis with their body. It's just something that astounds me. Have you checked that out? Have you got a second opinion? So find out. It's your body. It's this vessel that we get to locomote this planet on. If you're not sure of something, if you've got the experience, it's a different thing. But if you're not sure and it doesn't seem right, investigate.
You're so right. You say to people, if you have a discussion on TVs, and I can tell you now, the conversation between the pros and cons of a Samsung versus a Hisense versus a Sony, the number of pixels, and they know everything. Okay, but you ask them about their body and they know nothing.
Yep.
And that's insane. We have a responsibility to care for ourselves. And the problem is so many people leave that elderly care to someone else. They don't actually consciously do it, but their actions and their behavior dictates that as they get older, they're going to have to require someone else to look after them because they haven't taken responsibility. I admit, of course, there's a point where that happens, okay? But that shouldn't be happening at 65 or 70. It should be happening maybe at 85, 90, 95. Even then, you see people who are incredibly active. You go, if you're ever in Hong Kong overnight, when you wake up early in the morning, at the crack of dawn, go down to Victoria Park, and there'll be 1,000 people.
Yep.
Some people doing their qigong, some people doing their tai chi, other people just doing their calisthenics, and they're all out there moving,
staying healthy, staying young. Absolutely. So that's, as a management situation, RICED is fantastic. Now, moving beyond that, once you've gone through that process, number one thing I always say to the athletes is no niggles. So once you're coming back to start training again, whatever it happens to be, and there's all those things, you usually want to go from in a controlled, isolated environment before you go to partner work, before you go to something live, before you go to free sparring or commentator rolling or whatever. This needs to be stair-stepped. But initially, it's no injuries. No niggles, because every time you niggle whatever's been injured, you're setting it back, and you're starting just to stir it up. You're just poking at it a little bit. So it's important that there's no niggles, and that's where warm-ups become important. Slow to fast, general to specific. Start with drills, start on your own, and then introduce partner work. And that's the next thing. Your training partners can't read your mind. Your coach can't read your mind, although some senseis and shians can, but most probably can't. So it's important to let them know, hey, my knee's a little jammed up at the moment. Hey, I'm just coming back from something in my back. Hey, my ankle's not great. This shoulder's careful. So when we go to the ground, just, you don't have to advertise it or put it on Facebook or, make a big thing of it, but just let the people who need to know so that you can train in a way that you're able to progress and improve.
And if you don't tell them about your injury and they exacerbate it, it's not their fault.
No,
it's your fault. You have to take full responsibility for that. It's really, really important. I think that's really good advice. The niggle bit annoys me. Really, this is why most injuries can be prevented through taking responsibility, because we just don't listen to our body, I think.
It's very difficult to do. I can sit here openly and I can tell you no niggles, blah blah blah. But if I've got a niggle and I train, it'll be okay, because that little ego comes in.
We don't want to miss out on
You don't,
training
yeah, I
time.
want to train. I want to get better at this technique and improve it and so on. So, but there's this, and look, you don't want to go too far with it and put yourself in such cotton wool either and say, well, I can't do anything. And then 7 years later, you still haven't, done a single leg takedown or sparred around. But there is that, there's a balance. There's that yin and yang that's
use your brain.
Yeah.
Use your intelligence. You're given intelligence. Use it, for crying out loud.
Yeah, it's human ingenuity. We've got that. And that's the other point, is progress over perfection. Some sessions you'll be able to do more of. Some you might have to cut short. This is the training process. It does go up and down. Long term, it should look like this. But day to day, it's going to look a little bit like that, so long as it's heading in the direction that you need it to go on. And
it should look like that if you're giving your body a chance to recover periodically.
Absolutely. And the final thing is heat. We talk about warm-up and the benefits of heat and so on. And as you're coming back from some sort of injury or rehabilitation, heat's an extremely important thing. Giving blood flow to the area sends nutrition, sends oxygen, sends nutrients there. It's healing. It's a very good thing for vascular and even more avascular tissue. So you've got some tissues like muscle that are very vascular. They get a lot of blood. You've got other tissues like ligament that's incredibly avascular. It doesn't get a lot of blood or oxygen, but tiny, tiny, tiny bits. And they need that. That's why they take longer to heal generally. But what we want to make sure is heat is a double-edged sword, because you can be coming back from injury training in terms of the management phase, and things feel so good because they're warm and they feel great, and you push it a little bit too far, and then the next day you're so sore, because heat can have a type of analgesic effect. You don't realize what it's actually like. So you've got to use, what's it, the wisdom of Solomon? I think that's a saying, that wisdom of Solomon, to project forward and go, okay, I'm feeling fantastic. I might pull this session up here and see how I am tomorrow. And that could be one of the best things that you do, because tomorrow you realize, I'm okay. So I know how much I can do. Other times you push it too far and that can put you back a week. So keep that in mind as well.
So also used to say that all answers will be revealed through training. What he means is all answers will be revealed through intelligently applied conscious training. And when it comes to what to do with injuries and so on, the first thing that you can do is be careful. The next thing you can do is understand processes, well-established processes such as RICE. Okay, it's really important. The heat, some people go, yeah, you said put ice on it, now you're saying put heat on it. Okay, that's the sort of thing. That's why there's a number of different schools of thoughts. And for me, for example, joint injuries, it was ice. If I, for example, injured my shin, the way I used to deal with a shin injury is this. I would ice it immediately. Then after a period, I would get a heating balm. Usually I'd use Tiger Balm. And, a good, really painful crack on the shin is really painful. But if you don't deal with it, you're starting to get a buildup of poor movement of blood.
Scar tissue that's out of shape.
What will happen is the blood will pool, the blood will harden, the deformed muscle fiber will create a combination with the blood. You'll have scar tissue. So what I used to do is this. I'd find that bruise and I'd very gently rub it. And then I'd press it harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, with the objective of moving away all the pooling blood and bruising. And it would hurt for a while. And then as soon as I've done that, I'd put ice back on again. And I found by doing that helped me heal my specific injuries on my bones and so on really, really well.
Yeah, it's fantastic that. And there's deep depth to all these areas, but what Xian's talking about, we want our scar tissue to heal along the line of the bone in this case.
Yes,
We want
never
to
rub
across.
crossways.
Same as muscles. If you've got an injury, say to the bicep, just as an example, what you want to do is get length in there and go along the muscle fibers, because if you don't, it just pulls up. You get collagen, the scar tissue buildup that can impact the range that you have in your elbow extension, which if you're a grappler or you're a puncher or anything like that is not a good thing. So those specifics are really important.
There you go. Paul just mentioned, if you have an injury and don't rest it straight away, several months go by, it doesn't get better. Is it worth resting 5 months later? The golden rule. The best time to rest it is when you injure it. The second best time is now. It may be too late for some reasons, but it's never too late. And even if after 5 months you feel that it's not healing, you kind of screwed up 5 months ago, but you can go a long way to recovery by starting to rehab it now.
Of course. Absolutely.
That's
I couldn't
really
agree
important.
more. And time, while not the best thing, time does heal a lot of injuries, but it also has a detraining effect on other aspects of our body. So there's that balance in everything.
Yeah. Hey, Vicky, good to see you.
Hey,
That's
Vicky.
true. One of the things with grappling and BJJ at the moment is the prevalence of leg locks, and people don't understand the effect of injury when you're rotating ankles and so on. So it's really important, if you do get foot locked and you do get an extension of a hyperextension of the joint or something, get that ice on it and then rub it really, really hard to reduce the swelling, then put the ice back on. And I'm not a doctor, for crying out loud, but you need to understand, and you need to experiment, and you need to base everything on what works for you.
Very simply put, ice is an analgesic type thing, and it constricts and tightens. Heat is a vasodilator, and it increases. So using hot cold therapy, we see ice pools and saunas and things that people do, which I think are fantastic, can act like a little heat pump through the body. So if you're immobile, you can't move a joint because it's swollen, using ice and heat with each other, again, I'm not a doctor either or going too far with this, but that's one way you can put ice on to squeeze, and then you use the heat to open up. And that's one way to help blood and nutrients and oxygen get to the areas to help the areas heal, as Vicky's just talking about with leg locks as an example.
Yep. Another area which I won't even talk about, but just mention, is good nutrition. How can you heal a body if you're putting crap in it? So it's like, how can you run it? You never see a racing car that runs on unleaded. Well, what's that stuff? Ethanol based on,
yeah.
The best cars require the best fuel. And it's the same with your body. You need to give it the respect of healthy food. I think it's very important. Any suggestion on instep injury? What sort of injury? Is it an extension, hyperextension? Is it the bone? Is it the connective tissue? It all depends. But generally speaking, ice, rest, ice, compression, elevation. And if it is bone, well, then I love the idea of rubbing it with a heating ligament, rubbing it, and then putting the ice back on and wrapping it and isolating the movement, the movement, because the instep, as you flex and extend the ankle, there's a lot of movement going through the instep. You need to isolate that. Well, if a low kick has caught, you mean extension. So you're talking about a hyperextension of the ankle, okay? Because you did a low kick and it was caught on the knee and you hyperextended your instep, okay? What you got there is a joint injury, and what you need to do is manage it as a joint injury. So you isolate the movement of the joint and you get it diagnosed. You go to a doctor and you say, and you get them to look at it. That's very important. The other area that we don't really address often enough is what caused the injury. Generally, it's poor technique, or at least a technique that doesn't take into account the potential for injury. So I always used to say that 10% of all attack, 10% of all offense is defense. So even when you throw a really good punch or kick, you always have this hand up, because one day somewhere, some son of a gun's not going to play by your rules, and he'll throw that kick and you won't see it. So you want to make sure your hand's up. Well, it's the same with a kick. If you throw the kick at a certain target in a certain way, that increases the potential for hyperextension of the ankle joint, you need to change your technique. You need to be kicking not with the instep, but with the lower shin. The best place to kick is the lower shin, not the instep. The instep's good for speed kicks. So if you're going to snap the neck, snap the jaw, or even snap the inside thigh kick with speed, provided you do it with the correct timing so that their ability to block that is not available, well, then it's a safe thing. But generally speaking, if you're throwing a power shot, it takes a lot more time than a speed shot. So the potential for injury increases, which means you're going to have to change your technique and be aware of which part of your body. So Saul So used to say, know what you're hitting with, where you're hitting to, and how you're hitting. 自分のどこで相手のどこをどうやって蹴る、どうやって打つ. It's really important you understand all three of those things. And that will always then help you fix your technique. Anyway, there you have it. Good on you. Folks, thanks for coming along. I appreciate your time as always. Mitch, thanks. This is the third time Mitch and I trained twice together today already. I always mention that because Wednesday's our big day. Okay. And we look forward to seeing you next week. This is it for the injuries. Hopefully the advice we've given you will help you reduce not only the frequency of injury, but also the long-term drawbacks of getting injured. If you manage it correctly, you'll be able to return to training much quicker. If you don't manage it correctly, you will never be able to train properly. Again, it's that simple. The world is full of people who wear injuries like a badge, and you don't want to do that. Okay? Don't use it as an excuse. Thanks, everyone. Bashis, Paul, Marco, good to see you. Thanks again, Daniel, always. Sensei Mike, Vicky, just saw Vicky today too. Paul, thanks, guys. Listen, this is our last session until Christmas. So Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. If you're not part of the Christmas tradition, then all the best of the festive season to you. Have a great New Year, and we'll see you again in we'll see you after Christmas. Maybe not. We might take some time off. My daughter's coming to visit from Melbourne. My son's coming to visit from down the road. So we're all going to get together and have a nice. My sister, Elaine, who's a Shotokan black belt, by the way, she's visiting from the USA at the moment. So we're all going to have a great time. Merry Christmas. Us, all the best, and see you next time. Us. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Us.